My mother, Betty Moorhead, here in the front row. We welcome you to our last program of the season, and we will soon be working on next season. So we will go September through May on the third Thursday of the month, unless we adjust for a holiday around Christmas or Thanksgiving. And I'm going to let George introduce our speaker, but I just want to put my usual pitch in. I have a clipboard where I take email addresses, names and emails. If you want to be on our email list, I mail once a month prior to the next program. And then this August, I'll be sending out the notice of our upcoming year's season of programs. So we'll be arranging that and hope to have it all finalized in August when we print up programs, and then they will be available here in the library, and we have a website where everything is on. I want to give a special thank you to our wonderful camera woman, Barb. She's been many years. I know, I've lost track. And we thank her for filming this each month. And now, we're on behalf of BATV, and since so many of our guests don't get BATV, who live in other towns, they've been posting the last year and a half them on YouTube. So you just need an internet connection, and I always put a link on our website by the speaker. You can look under current season at booksbetweenbites.com, and you'll find the link, and you can watch Rick Hogan's wonderful program from last month and Lester Munson's. They're all up there except the mayor's got lost. I wanted to watch it, but our December program, right? I think it got over something happened. But anyway, even last year's programs are up there. Look at the website, and it's a great way to share the programs you've enjoyed that friends didn't get to see. So I'll put the clipboard up here, and you can sign it afterwards. And thank you so much for being part of Books Between Bites. I have to look. Next year will be our 33rd season. Wow. And we thank the library, George and Stacy, for all they do and set up, and we're a partnership, and we really enjoy it. And I'm on tippy toes too long.
We could lower that.
I know.
It's too high for me. This is like, it's about ready to fall off. So let's fix this. Well, I'm screwing around with this. My name is George Sheets, and I'm the library director here. And so happy that you're all here today. The library is a great place to be on a blustery day, isn't it? Yeah. There we go. The joy of technology. There we go. Dan will probably take it out and just use it a different way. Okay, anyway, welcome to the library. Our speaker today is Dan Hoefler, who I first met through the Rotary Club of Batavia when he became a member there. He's currently our president, accidentally serving a 1.5-year term rather than just a single-year term because of someone moving from town abruptly, and so Dan has really been putting a lot of work in the community in that respect. But he does a lot of the community anyway. He's a retired educator, lives in Batavia, was an educator in Oswego, and also with Waubonsee Community College for 38 years. Held posts from teacher to principal. Were you in the central office as well?
Never wanted to go there. Not after what I learned from you.
Okay, teacher to principal. That was it. Okay. Dan is a city alderman in Batavia. He's been on the Historic Commission. He's involved with the Brotherhood Banquet, youth baseball in the past. He's on the board of the Historical Society now, and very much involved with the Depot Museum expansion project, which he's putting a lot of time and effort into. And he and I are actually, in that respect, are working together on a project that I will announce now for September. The Historical Society and the Batavia Public Library Foundation are bringing Mark Twain to Batavia on September 26th at the Fine Arts Center. And he looks good for his age, I must say. And it's really a joint fundraiser for the Library Foundation, which supports the library, and for the Depot expansion project. And tickets will be on sale soon, I think, for the fall, and we're going to have a special ticket level for people that want to have cocktails with Clemens prior to the event, and the Historical Society is organizing that piece of it. So mark your calendars for September 26th. It'll be a fun evening. And we're doing that because this is the year of Mark Twain in Batavia. It was 150 years ago in January that Mark Twain came to Batavia and gave a lecture as part of one of his very first lecture tours, Lyceum tours, they called it back then. And so we're celebrating Mark Twain's 150th anniversary of his visit, which is also commemorated by the gentleman sitting on the bench outside of our front door. So enough on that. We came here to hear about a very special event in our history, and Dan is the man to tell you about it. Please give a warm welcome to Dan Hoefler.
Is this good for everybody? Yes. Everybody hear that? Good, thank you. When I was standing outside just a few minutes ago, Joe Yeagle was coming in, and he said, gee, the weather is just about what it was like before the Allied troops boarded the ships on June 4th. They got on, then they got off, and then they got back on again. So, Joe, you remembered that. Thank you. How many of you, he was not there. How many of you have been to Normandy and the beaches? Raise your hand. Well, thank you. That's tremendous. When my wife and I celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary, and we were talking about, well, where do we want to go? And the first thing I said, well, I want to go to France and to the Normandy beaches. And that's exactly what we did. Of course, we stopped in Paris for 4 days, and we did a riverboat cruise down the Seine out to the beaches, and we had a beautiful day, except for the French farmers who were on strike and blocked the only road going into the beaches. Something about the French and strikes. I think they have one once a week. It must be a national thing. But while I was there, I made a promise to members of my family, my children, and others who wanted to. I brought a couple of containers. And when I was on the beach at the 1st Division Memorial, and when you see the 1st Division Memorial on the Normandy beaches, that's where, when Spielberg filmed the famous scene coming aboard, that's where that takes place. And then there's the bluffs in back of that, and then up on the bluffs is where the American Cemetery is located. So I made a promise. I brought home sand. For anybody that wants. I get emotional. Always do. So we're here on D-Day. Better get the glasses on. One of the interesting elements that Stephen Ambrose talks about concerning D-Day is that it was highly photographed. And one of the men who was there would later become the director for most of John Wayne's famous movies, John Ford. John Ford was there at D-Day, and he took a lot of the photographs. And in fact, when Spielberg filmed Saving Private Ryan, he looked back in the archives, because they were at the Army Archives and also National Archives in Washington, D.C., to get an idea. So they went back and they resurrected the same type of camera that Ford and other people were using that day on Omaha, Utah Beach, along with Sword, Juno, and Gold Beaches, which were the British and the Canadian beachheads. And this is one of the more famous and iconic photographs. And in fact, when you watch Saving Private Ryan, what's the first thing that you see as they're approaching the beach? It goes down and the men go off. That is his tribute to those men leaving and going on to the beachhead at Omaha that day. All right, do I go point that way? All right, here we go. Into the particulars. This is General George Marshall. I consider George Marshall to be one of the great Americans of the 20th century. Not a lot of people today recognize that, but if you're a historian or you've studied the history of the middle part of the 20th century, George Marshall is a great man. Not only because of leading the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Second World War, but also for the Berlin airlift and becoming Secretary of State. But he had Franklin Roosevelt as president. Franklin Roosevelt was a manipulator. He was a consummate politician. He had his detractors, but most people remember FDR fondly for taking the nation through the Depression and through the Second World War. But on December 5th, FDR calls him into the Oval Office. And he says, George, I have to make a decision. FDR knew exactly. He already made the decision. And George Marshall, being the good soldier that he was, said, Mr. President, I know what decision you're going to make. I know it's an important one, but I will defer to you and your judgment as to who will command Operation Overlord, who will be the overall commander in Europe going in 1944. And FDR said, good, here's a notepad, take a message and write this to Joseph Stalin. I've appointed Dwight D. Eisenhower to become the operational commander for D-Day, and that's pointed out in Mr. Ambrose's book. I should say, I'll get back to that in another second here. Okay, on to the next slide. 1944, the most difficult and complicated operation to ever take place. This is Winston Churchill's statement. So where are we in 1944 before D-Day takes place that year? It's a year when the Red Army has pushed back the Wehrmacht at Leningrad and Stalingrad, and in fact, by June of 1944, they were already getting close to Poland. They were moving and they were putting intense pressure on the German army on the Eastern Front. Also, it's important to note that one of the most horrific episodes in human history has been taking place. 3 million people have already died in the gas chambers. 1944, those numbers would almost double. On their way from Hungary, on the railroad cars, a second railroad line had been built and put into Auschwitz. 1 million Hungarian Jews were on their way to be murdered. And there's always a question about the motivation of the soldiers that you see at Normandy that day, or in the Allied Army, those fighting in Italy, those that had fought in North Africa, those that were fighting on the Atlantic and the Pacific, the sailors, the airmen. Everybody always refers to World War II as the good war, that it was the war between good and evil. Did the American serviceman, whatever branch he was in, did he recognize and realize the momentous year that 1944 was going to be? Yes. Now, those men and women who served, they won't tell you that. But they understood that. They understood that in their heart. They knew what they were fighting for. They knew and recognized what evil was. And Auschwitz and Dachau and all the other camps, Treblinka, were all symbolic of that evil. Now, there's always been A lot of controversy. Did the Allied governments know? They absolutely knew what was going on in Eastern Europe, especially in Poland. That's a whole nother story entirely, and we don't have enough time to go through that. But I just wanted to point out, in terms of the Allied soldiers and what they were fighting for in 1944 and the final solution. Now, there's something else about 1944 that is extremely important to recognize. FDR is a very sick man. A new heart surgeon is appointed, a younger man, someone that FDR did not know through Walter Reed Hospital, and Ambrose points this out in his book. You look at the pictures of FDR in 1944, he is gravely ill. He has a horrible heart condition. In fact, when the new doctor takes over and takes his blood pressure, the very first time he meets him in the Oval Office, FDR's blood pressure was 240 over 180. Yeah, that's pretty high. But they were keeping him alive. In fact, right before the invasion takes place in 1944, FDR takes a sabbatical. And not a lot of people remember that and know that. He went to a plantation, if I could use that word, it was still referred to as that in 1944, from a friend from the United States Senate, and he spent 2.5 months there recuperating. But he was back in the Oval Office by May of 1944 and taking command again and getting in contact with his operational commanders in Europe, especially Eisenhower. On to the next slide. This is Stephen Ambrose. Many of you may recognize him from the time from television. He's a longtime professor of history at the University of New Orleans. He's written a number of books on U.S. history, Undaunted Courage, which is the journey of Lewis and Clark and the opening of the American West. He's written D-Day, as well as multiple volume biographies of Eisenhower and Nixon. He founded the Eisenhower Center, which is in New Orleans, and he was the first president of the National D-Day Museum, which is in New Orleans. It's no longer called that, I believe. It's the National World War II Museum, but it focuses a great deal of attention on the Second World War and D-Day. And why did they select New Orleans? That's where the Higgins boats were produced. The men that would board the boats to go ashore onto the beaches, that's where they were produced. They also produced them in Seneca, Illinois. There was a plant in Seneca, and they would take the landing craft, they'd put them on barges, and they would ship them down to New Orleans, and then they would ship them, of course, over to Europe for their use. And D-Day was more important than the war in the Pacific, according to FDR. He wanted to beat Adolf Hitler. Winston Churchill wanted to beat Adolf Hitler. Joseph Stalin, trust me, wanted Hitler dead. There was no question in the minds of the big three, because they had met in 1943 in Tehran, and they began to plot out the war. And that's when FDR famously made his pledge to Stalin, we're going to invade in 1944. But first they went to Italy. And they used the boats and the ships that were there when they landed, especially at Anzio, and they shipped them back to England for use on June 6th. His film work included consulting roles on 2 Spielberg projects, Saving Private Ryan and a documentary about D-Day. He also consulted on the miniseries which was on HBO, which was The Band of Brothers. And many of you may have seen Band of Brothers. In fact, when I was still teaching at Oswego, one of the men who was in they were the Easy Aces, 101st Airborne, Bill Garnier, I believe his name was. I was able to invite him to our school, and he gave a talk to our history classes. A very fascinating event that day. He just recently passed not too long ago, and we should probably mention that we lose about 100 veterans a day from the Second World War. Over 3 million men and women now are gone. One more thing about Spielberg and D-Day and Stephen Ambrose. Ambrose did not consult, but Spielberg said, I want to bring you out to Hollywood, and I want you to take a look at this and tell me where I can improve it. Ambrose said, no. I'm not getting on a plane. I'm not going to Hollywood. I'm busy with my project here. If you want me to watch the film, send it here. So Spielberg did just that. He rented on a Sunday morning a movie theater in New Orleans. They had armed guards at all of the entrances, and Ambrose was able to bring 2 other friends. And they sat there and they watched Saving Private Ryan. He called them right after it was over. And these are Ambrose's exact words: don't change a thing. Don't change a thing. And here's Stalin. What a happy guy. You know, history be told, if you look at all the millions that were slaughtered, I think they add up more than what Hitler was responsible for with the final solution. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But the history of war does not know of an undertaking comparable to it in the breadth of conception, grandeur of scale, and mastery of execution. He wanted that second front. He needed to take the pressure off of the Red Army. And he had been angling for this since 1942. He was upset when the Allied armies went into North Africa first. He was upset when they went into Italy, mostly because Churchill wanted that, because he thought it was an easier path to go through the mountains of Italy. And by the way, the German army was still fighting at the end of 45 in northern Italy in the Alps. They never did surrender officially, that part of it. But he wanted the Eastern Front to be relieved because he was suffering massive deaths and he was holding Hitler at bay. So, who are the major combatants on D-Day? Well, we know, of course, the United States, Britain, and Canada, and we knew that what their target was, Nazi Germany. Why did it happen? Quite simply, the Allies wanted to free France from German control. They had to first conquer the coast of France so they could then liberate Western Europe and defeat Hitler. This was the way in. This was the way in. Oops, wrong one. Okay. One of the big parts of what Ambrose talks about is deception. And how many of you watched the movie Patton? And you know that Patton was he was on the outs. After slapping a soldier in Sicily, he was brought back. Well, the movie makes it sound like, gee, Patton was just being punished. Did he even know he was being used? Yes, he did. Patton was fully aware that he was part of the phony army. And the way that the Allied forces understood and knew that the phony army was active and was effective and was working was because in 1942, a British destroyer had forced to the surface a German U-boat. And there they got their hands on a working Enigma machine. That's how they knew. And they were breaking the German codes. And they were feeding disinformation into Europe. And of course, everybody understands what the biggest deception was of the war. It wasn't the phony army. It wasn't feeding the disinformation. It was for one goal, was to absolutely convince the German army that the invasion was going to take place at Calais, which was the closest point between England and France. Did it work? History says it did, but it was a horrible cost. There's no question that it was a horrible cost. That's what an Enigma machine looks like. The U-505, at the Museum of Science and Industry, they got their hands on one too. But they weren't the first. They weren't the first. Before the invasion, the night before the invasion, Allied troops, we know, parachuted into enemy lines in France. Their objective: destroy the railroad lines, disrupt communication, hold the bridges. So when the breakout occurred from the beachheads, that's when they needed to be there to secure those bridges and so on. But there was tremendous confusion. I think when you watch Band of Brothers, the second episode, when they drop in to the landing zones, they were landing all over the place and trying to get themselves organized to begin to do what they were designed to do, or what they were being asked to do. It was important that they get that put back together. This is Eisenhower. This is, again, one of the iconic photographs of Eisenhower and talking to the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne. These were Eisenhower's messages. This went to all the troops. You are about to embark on a great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck. But even though he was saying that, I know some of you are probably aware of this, he had also written another letter. And that letter is what you read there. Our landies in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. And he dated it July 5th. Not June 4th, 5th, when he wrote it. He accidentally put down the wrong month when he wrote this. Yeah, it's in the National Archives. They still have this letter. So on June 6, 1944, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel. And that included the French, the Poles, Norwegian. It was truly an Allied army. But the bulk of it were the American and British and Canadian soldiers. They attacked the coastline over 60 miles. This is a Higgins boat. This is what they were taking in to the shores. Now, when you look at, okay, I got a pointer here. This was the area that they were going when they left the ports up here in Portsmouth and Poole and Portland and Shoreham by the Sea. This is where this was their rallying point. And it was called Piccadilly Circus. And once they had formed up the 5,000 ships that were part of the Allied Armada, then they broke off into the various beachheads. Here's Le Havre. Oops, oh, what am I doing? Here we go, I'm back again. All right. There you go. You've got Sword, which was British. The Canadians had Juno. Gold was British. Omaha, which had the most horrific casualties that day. Utah. And then, of course, Pointe du Hoc, which was right up here. The big thing that had been left for the British Army to take under Montgomery, and I'm not going to get into the rivalry between Patton and Montgomery had hoped to get overall operational command, was to take Caen. It took him over a month to finally get to Caen to take it. This was a critical junction point because it was a crossroads and the railroads. And this is what the Allied Army wanted to do. But they called it Piccadilly Circus, and this is where the beachheads are. And it was over a 60-mile stretch. The soldiers faced intense opposition from the Germans wherever they landed. Again, a photograph of them on the Higgins boats, the men coming ashore. This was in the second wave. That was in the second wave. Let's see. Okay, I got it. All right. Let's see. I'm off. Eisenhower, Channel Crossing, Cherbourg, landing areas. Okay, here we go. No, I went past one. Okay, here we go. Herr Hitler, we have arrived. It was a Jewish soldier from New York who made that statement when he landed on the beachhead. They were there. So when I talked about, did they understand? They understood. Herr Hitler, we have arrived. They faced intense opposition from the Germans. So now I'm going to go into the book itself, and I'm going to read you some passages from time to time. So forgive me for doing the readings, but I think they're important to illustrate certain things, especially about what was going on the beachhead. In the July 20th issue, the Bulletin, which was a local newspaper in Bedford, Virginia. Does anybody know why I'm going to Bedford, Virginia? Reported that the 116th had been awarded a presidential citation and that it recorded the awful news that on July 19th, 14 families in Bedford were informed that their sons had been killed on June 6th. 34 men from a National Guard unit were sent to England, were trained, 14 of them. It turned out later that there were 19 who had been killed at Normandy and on the beaches, 14 just on June 6th alone. There would be more news to come. They died as all free men should die. Gallantly and unafraid. They knew what was before them. There was no shirking or hesitation, no holding back, no attempt to escape. At the Normandy American Cemetery Memorial overlooking Omaha Beach, there are 11 sons of Bedford, along with 9,386 other Americans. The worst loss of life for any single community on one day in the Second World War, and it occurred at D-Day. We recognize Field Marshal, the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel. Rommel was a great general. When you list the great generals throughout history, his name is going to be up there. He was entrusted by Adolf Hitler to begin the defense. After they lost in North Africa, he's moved up to prevent the Allied invasion from taking place. So from his experience with the Allied air interdiction, he knew he was going to not have the Luftwaffe. They weren't going to be available in the numbers that they had been earlier in the war. So he had to figure out a defensive posture for his troops to make sure that they prevented the Allied army from coming ashore. He advocated the placement of reserve forces immediately behind the coastal defense works for counterattacks. However, his superiors, the field marshals that reported to Hitler, they demurred. They were not in favor of that. They had positioned them further back, which of course worked to our advantage at that point. The disagreement had fostered within organizations charged with repelling the Allies weakened the effectiveness of the German defense when the invasion finally came along the Normandy coast. As you know, many men were killed and injured before they even reached the beaches. U.S. troops take shelter behind the German Hedgehogs. These were obstacles that were designed to prevent Allied landing craft from getting too close to the Allied lines. I love this photograph. They're there waiting for them. They're waiting for our boys to arrive on the beaches in front of one of the numerous bunkers that had been placed. Now, this is the Atlantic Wall. They built, and it was out all the way to about 300-400 yards. Here's the bluff, right here. This was what they had to scale to get over in order to begin to push the German army back. So they had to get through the Hedgehogs. This is the top view of it. They had to get through the Belgian gates and log posts. They had the leg ramps, which were here, and then they had the hedgehogs. And this was known as the shingle. So when the troops came in, they came in here, they had to move up to here, and then they had to move across the shelf or the beaches here, and then they got stuck right here because the German gun emplacements were up here firing down. It was murderous fire on our boys on the beaches. Murderous fire, crossfire, but that's where they were. Let's go to the next slide. This is a Higgins boat, one of the LCVPs that were in the combat zone. They could both, all right, wait a second. All right, how do I go back? Okay. All right, let's see, what do I want to do here? I screwed up. Yeah, would you do that, please? I think my hand is too big for the remote. First time anybody's told me that. Maybe I should run for president. Bad joke, I'm sorry. Okay, I think that's where we are, right. Okay, here we go. So these were constructed, these boats were made of wood with steel plating. It was cheap, relatively simple to build. Thousands of them were built. They were 36 feet long, 3 inches wide. The draft was just 2 feet, 2 inches. Crew consisted of 3, driver, 2 gunners, right there. It was a 225 horsepower. It could displace 1,800 pounds. And the armament was 230 caliber machine guns and 12 knots. So this is what the men were on when they landed on the beachhead. Now, this is a part of the story that Ambrose likes to talk about, and I'm going to read a section here because we're getting to pay tribute to the United States Navy with this one. After 2 hours of such frustration, just before this, Ambrose is describing the beachhead and how smoky it was and that you couldn't see what was going on because the battleships had been firing. And when the battleships fired onto the beachhead and the German placements of their bunkers and stuff, the shells were going over, they were landing, but they weren't doing a great deal of damage. The German 105s, the 88s that they employed, they were still very effective. So they were hitting our boys on the beaches because a lot of them were 4 to 5 miles back along from the beachhead. So they had a direct line of fire. It wasn't very effective. The United States Navy came to the aid of the soldiers on the beachhead. Let me read you this. After 2 hours of such frustration, skippers began to act on their own responsibility. Evidently, the first to do so was Lieutenant Commander Ralph "Rebel" Ramey on the destroyer McCook. He sailed into the western sector of Omaha, close enough to see that the troops were not getting up the bluff. He began blasting away with his 5-inch guns at the Verville exit, hitting gun positions, pillboxes, buildings, dug in cliff positions. 2 guns were set into the cliff. The beaches were particular targets. After almost an hour of shooting, one of the German guns fell off the cliff onto the beach and the other blew up. Private Ernest Hilberg of the 1st Division was on the Higgins boat. The coxswain had received orders not to land yet, so with those shells flying past, Hilberg remembered, "We decided to find a place to hide. McCook was a great place to hide, so we hid behind her, as did many other hundreds of landing craft were behind the destroyers as they were trying to clear a path onto the beachhead, spotting the gun emplacements. We were scared to death. McCook was going to run aground." And that's just one of the stories of the United States Navy coming to the aid, coming to within less than 1,500 yards of the beachheads, taking intense fire from the German guns themselves to support the troops on the beach. Okay, here we come to Adolf Hitler. Now, there's a lot of controversy about, the whole thing that I mentioned earlier. Should we have brought the Panzers up? Should they have been placed right behind the German lines along the beachhead? Should we hold them back in reserve? Well, considering the pivotal nature of June 6th, how did Hitler respond? Did he rant? Did he rail? Did he move with focused calm to try and repel the invaders? Well, this is what I can tell you in doing the research. He did none of those things. For D-Day's opening act, Hitler was asleep. And I think some of the movies demonstrate that he was sleeping. He was at the Berghof, his residence in the Bavarian Alps. He was still asleep at 10 a.m. Now, the battle had started at 4:30 when the troops began to disembark from the naval ships onto the beachhead. So for 5-6 hours, Hitler is asleep. That's when Nazi associate and arms minister Albert Speers arrived. He was awakened around noon, so for 2 more hours, he's allowed to rest. Hitler was not angry or vindictive. Far from it, he was relieved. The news, his words, were recorded by Speer. The news couldn't be better, Hitler said when he was informed of the invasion, according to Ambrose. At lunchtime, a military conference, Hitler finally agreed with von Rundstedt's request to move the Panzers up. But at this point, it was too late. So later on June 6th, Hitler attended a reception near Salzburg for the new Austrian minister. If you know where the Bavarian Alps are, it's near Munich and Salzburg in that lovely country. You need to go there someday. The new foreign minister, when he entered the room, he was radiant. It has begun at last. Again, the bravery of the U.S. serviceman on D-Day. It's interesting to note of the 150,000 men who participated in D-Day in the invasion forces, 12 were awarded our nation's highest honor. These are the names of the men who were awarded. You can know the asterisk, a lot of them were posthumous awards. You know, the military doesn't act quickly, so a lot of the awards were given to family after the war was over. But I want to read 2 for you of the men, Carlton W. Barrett and Theodore Roosevelt, yes, Teddy's son. Carlton was a private U.S. Army 18th Infantry, 1st Infantry Division. He entered service in New York. He was born in New York. Citation: for gallantry and intrepidity, easy for me to say, at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty on 6 June, in the vicinity of Saint-Lon-sur-Mer, France, on the morning of D-Day, Private Barrett, landing in the face of extreme heavy enemy fire, was forced to wade ashore through neck-deep water. Disregarding the personal danger, he returned to the surf again and again to assist his floundering comrades and save them from drowning, refusing to remain pinned down by the intense barrage of small arms and mortar fire powered on at the landing points. Private Barrett, working with fierce determination, saved many lives by carrying casualties to an evacuation boat lying offshore. In addition to his assigned mission as a guide, he carried dispatch as the length of the fire swept the beach. He assisted the wounded, he calmed the shock, he arose as a leader in the stress of the occasion. His coolness and dauntless, daring courage, while consistently risking his life during a period of many hours, had an inestimable effect on his comrades and in keeping with the highest traditions of the Army. And now, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. He was a brigadier general. He entered service at Oyster Bay, which was the traditional home of the Theodore Roosevelt family on Long Beach. Again, after 2 verbal requests to accompany the leading assault elements of the Normandy invasion and being denied, Brigadier General Roosevelt's written request for this mission was finally approved, and he landed with the first wave of the forces assaulting the enemy-held beaches. He repeatedly led groups from the beach over the seawall and established them inland. His valor, courage, and presence in the very front of the attack, and his complete unconcern at being under heavy fire, inspired the troops to heights of enthusiasm and self-sacrifice. Although the enemy had the beach under constant direct fire, Brigadier General Roosevelt moved from one locality to another, rallying men around him, directing and personally led them against the enemy. Under his seasoned, precise, calm, and unfaltering leadership, assault troops reduced beach strongholds and rapidly moved inland with minimum casualty. He thus contributed substantially to the successful establishment of the beachhead in France. Americans react to the news. Millions went to church. And I need to read from Ambrose's book some of the really great things that he writes about what was going on here. All right, let's go. The first time. Okay. Later in the day on June 6, Eisenhower finally sent a communique, which went out through the news services, such as they were at that time, particularly NBC. Had a reporter there, and also Edward R. Murrow, who was in London and was reporting back to the CBS network. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France. By 14:15 Eastern Wartime, NBC had an eyewitness report from London by a reporter who had flown with the 101st Airborne Division. Through the morning, more eyewitness reports came from the reporters who had been at sea and had returned to London. They had seen a lot of smoke, ships, planes, little else. There was nothing from the beaches. And as the news began to filter in across the nation, FDR went on the radio, and he led the nation in prayer. At 2200 Eastern Wartime, the President, along with Americans, prayed, "Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor. Lead them straight and true. Give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness in their faith. These men are lately drawn from the ways of peace. They fight not for the lust of conquest. They fight to end conquest. They fight to liberate. They yearn, but not for the end of battle, but for the return to the haven of home. Some will never return," says FDR. "Embrace them, Father, and receive them, thy heroic servants, into thy kingdom. And, O Lord, give us faith. Give us faith in thee, faith in our sons, faith in each other. Thy will be done, Almighty God. Amen." FDR. What else was happening on June 6th across the nation? Let's look at New York City, as Ambrose points out. It was a bustling, prosperous place. Everyone had jobs and more cash than there were products to buy. Apartments were hard and impossible to find. People doubled and tripled up. Bars and movie theaters were jammed. The spring season on Broadway was a big success, topped by Oklahoma, by Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein, Paul Robeson in Othello, Milton Berle in the Ziegfeld Follies, and Mary Martin in One Touch of Venus. With a book by Ogden Nash and staged by Elia Kazan, with dances by Agnes de Miller. But on D-Day, Broadway shut down. Lights of Broadway dim. The New York Daily News threw out its lead articles and printed in their place the Lord's Prayer. The New York Daily Mirror eliminated all advertising so as to have room for invasion news. Stores shut down. Macy's closed. Lord & Taylor was closed. In fact, it never opened at all. President Walter Hoovering said he was sending his 3,000 employees home to play. The store is closed. The invasion has begun. Our only thought can be of the men who are fighting in it. We have closed our doors because we know our employees and customers have loved ones in the battle. and wanting to give this day to hopes and prayers. Baseball games and racing programs were canceled. Horse racing was a big sport at that time. The only place that didn't close down, but they took 2 minutes for silent prayer, was Wall Street. And then the last, on June 6th. In New York and throughout the land, bells tolled. The greatest of these was the Liberty Bell. It had last tolled on July 8, 1835, for the funeral of Chief Justice John Marshall. At 7 o'clock on D-Day, Philadelphia Mayor Bernard Samuel tapped the bell with a wooden mallet, sending his voice throughout the country over a radio network, and then he offered a prayer. So Americans prayed. They prayed for victory. They prayed for the safe return of their loved ones. As we know, it was the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. By May of 1945, the war in Europe was over, but not until a terrible cost continued to be paid. And my last slide, you can read that for yourself. Thank you. Questions? Oh, I hope I can answer them.
Is your last slide of Arlington National Cemetery?
No. That's at Normandy. This is the American Cemetery there. And every day, I think it's at 4 in the afternoon, they play taps, and they, they do the Star Spangled Banner, and they do one other.
Marseillaise.
No, they don't, no, not the French. I'm trying to remember. We were there when they did that. And I was talking with the couple that came in.
Yeah.
There you are.
And I can't remember what else they played.
Yeah, there were two, the Star Spangled Banner, taps, and then with the cruise lines or the bus tours that you go with, they'll give you a flower, and then you can go out into the cemetery and lay a grave. Like our friends here, we went and found somebody from Illinois, you know, and we placed flowers on that grave that day. You know, I'm going to get this wrong. I hope I don't. But the one grave, and I mentioned his name earlier when I talked about his bravery, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. You know, he had a cane. That part of it is true. He walked with a limp. And in spite of that infirmity, he still led his troops on D-Day. He's buried there, and he has a special section. There's a small section that's cut out just for Theodore Roosevelt Jr. And I think he's the only officer, general officer, in other words, brigadier general rank or above, that's allowed to be buried there. Anyone else was an infantryman, serviceman of the 9,600 that are buried there. It's something.
And I think this was worth mentioning. We were on a trip and we were guided by a French figure. And because I had been in service, I was invited to place the flag at the.
Oh.
And after that, he did the stuff at the banner. And I was standing next to him and he was singing at the top of his voice, and I'll never forget that moment because it was really
Yeah, I think in spite of our differences sometimes between countries, I think the people remember and they care. They know. The people of France know. Jeff?
Yeah, I'm aware of at least two Batavians who were directly involved in it. One of them was Carl Wachonki, who was the executive at Furnace Electric for a number of years. Several years back, a couple of decades ago, he was the speaker for the Memorial Day service for Batavia, and at that service he told his memories of the Normandy invasion. So Carl's two sons are friends of mine. I went to school with them, and I'm trying to get them, they're trying to look for their dad's speech. They think they may still have it. I think that would be a nice record for the Historical Society to have, a Batavian who actually was there. The other one that was there was my father, and he was a Army medic assigned to a doctor who was from Lorain, Ohio. And during the invasion, they were out in the boat that was just off the shore there. Supposedly it was just placed so it was outside the firing ability of those guns on the shoreline. But there was a bad storm out there, and it was really bouncing around. My dad always talked about, he knew he was up for 72 hours straight because they kept bringing in all these wounded guys off the beach to be worked on. And he didn't go in on the actual shore for about 7-8 days after the actual invasion. But I remember going with him to see the movie D-Day, and he got pretty emotional about it because he said it was pretty realistic from what they put together, from what he remembered from being there. He got the Bronze Star for it. I have it at home. I'm very proud of it. But there's a lot, there is some Batavia connection there because we do have some of our own residents who physically were involved in the fight.
That might be an interesting project for the museum is to try and, I don't know, have we ever made an effort to try and record the remembrances of our veterans before we lose them all?
Not that I recall. There is a book in the gift shop, Veterans of the Fox Valley,
Right.
but that was somebody else's endeavor, and they just shared the book with the museum.
I mean, Ambrose, when he wrote this book, recorded 1,400 veterans, just so that he would have an accurate record. Ambrose gets buffeted sometimes from other historians. They said he wrote things to make it too popular so he could sell books and was more interested in promoting Ambrose. But, for my money, he was a great historian. He was a great storyteller. If you ever watch him on any of the PBS programs, especially the Undaunted Courage, how he described things, what Lewis and Clark face, he's just great, kind of like David McCullough. How many of you like David McCullough? McCullough is a great speaker and great storytellers. That's what makes history come alive. I can't hold a candle to either one of those two men in terms of their knowledge. I mean, the things that just come off the top of the head. I have to have notes to remember everything.
We were at the cemetery, and that's a lovely picture, but, there are so many crosses, you can't see them all in one view. And we also had a flower to place in Illinois, and we looked for the ones, there were several who say, known only to God. They didn't have names.
Yeah. The thing that our military today has done, somebody help me with this. What's the name of the forensic unit that they have, and it's based in Honolulu, and they go all over the world documenting and trying to find the remains of soldiers and sailors and airmen that have been lost and identifying them. I think, what was it, Jeff, a year ago, the young man from the Oklahoma that was buried in the Riverwood Cemetery, I think he was one of those that they were finally able to identify through records and DNA. And I think that brings closure to a family who's just wondering what happened to them. One of the interesting things, and there's so much around D-Day. I mean, to try and condense it into, 45 minutes and leave time for questions is really difficult to do. What we wanted to do when I talked to George and Stacy was just to remember June 6th as it comes up here in less than a month, what took place on the 75th anniversary. You think I get emotional? A little bit. I can remember the one time I'm watching on the Ronald Reagan would have been there in 1984, which would have been, help with the math, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, and he's with the soldiers who scaled up to Pointe du Hoc. And he cried.
When
I was in high school in the 50s, we all gathered to see a film documentary. Part of the film showed the liberation of the death camps with the open graves and the skeletons and everything. Another part of it, which is what made me think of it, was a time lapse of the way FDR looked from the beginning of his first term until the end. And it was like the picture of Dorian Gray.
Yeah, he withered away. I mean, the stress, he had the congestive heart failure. There were a number of different things that was ailing FDR's liver, but they kept him alive as long as they could until he went to Warm Springs and had the hemorrhage, the brain hemorrhage, which ultimately killed him.
Yeah, I was wondering, did you run across anything about, now the Germans had defenses set up with MG-42s, and they had crossfires and everything. Were the conscripts in charge of the MG-42s, and then they had a German in back of them with a pistol in case they decided not to shoot?
I didn't see anything regarding conscripts. Hitler, ultimately he was excited about like I said, he was excited because he knew that if he could defeat the Western forces and push them off the beaches and to prevent them from getting a foothold, then he could consolidate his forces on the Eastern Front and stop the Russians, at least at the point that they had advanced. So it was that's why when he said he was excited, it's begun. Now he could, do what I just kind of described, that he wanted to push them out so he could keep the Eastern fronts from going under. But of course, the Russians just applied tremendous pressure, and as we pressured, the Wehrmacht on the Western Front, and of course, the part of the story that goes on, the breakout really from Cannes and beyond after the month of June and July, August, is when Patton took command of the Third Army and started the swing through Belgium and up into Belgium and Luxembourg to cross the Rhine. The young lady that was my English department chair, maybe I shouldn't tell. Well, I'll tell you. Open my mouth now. I better tell the story. There was a photograph taken of Patton crossing the Rhine. But before he crossed the Rhine River, he wanted to show his disdain for Adolf Hitler. So there's a picture of him standing on the shore of the Rhine River urinating into it in full whatever. He found out about it and wanted that picture and the negatives destroyed. And they destroyed all the pictures that they could find because he didn't want to be embarrassed by that. But Jean's uncle, he was one of the photographers. He had one of the photographs of Patton, and she brought it in to show me, and she says, take a look at this. And I want it's George Patton. She says, look closer. Oh.
That is George.
Oh, hello.
The pillboxes there were so intact.
Yes.
After 70 years. It's unbelievable. It's, you got half a dozen MG-42s set up there, and if they knew how to shoot them, I don't see how any American got on that.
Again, it goes straight to the bravery of the American soldier, who endured that withering fire. When Pat and I were there 4 years ago, 4 years ago, that was one of the things that I was disappointed. The American cemetery is pristine. You don't leave a cigarette butt. You don't do anything to dishonor those men at all in any way, shape, or form. But when you go to the various points of the battlefield, they're becoming, they're going into ruins, so to speak. They're not being well maintained. Where you go as an American to visit Vicksburg, you go to visit Gettysburg, you go to Harper's Ferry, you go to Yorktown. What we have done as Americans in this country with the American Battlefield Commission is we preserve these places so that generation after generation can learn and see what's going on instead of it falling into disrepair and ruins. I mean, you can walk the beachhead, you can walk up on the cliffs, you can walk through the, where the shells landed, the craters. I mean, they're still all there, but they're overgrown, they're weedy, they don't take really good care. I was even kind of disappointed with the care that was given at Point du Hoc, but that was French territory. The French own that. We own the American cemetery. That's us. That's ours. So I just wish that they would preserve more of the battlefield. I mean, when you go onto the British beaches where they landed the first mulberries, the mulberries were the portable ports, the landing docks that they would use for the ships to come in to unload more soldiers and the equipment. They're all even falling into disrepair. I mean, pretty soon it's all going to be gone, in terms of where they were.
Storm wiped them out. I mean, there's a few of them sitting out.
There's just a few. Yeah, there's just a few that are left. Well, I want to thank everybody for staying and listening today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I was able to give you some information that you might not have heard before and done so in an entertaining way. Thank you very much.